Bonjour, je vais parler en anglais, quand même que je parle un tout petit peu de français. It's wonderful to be invited into a conversation with a future in a city which so shows the power of imagination to shift the way the city works. I had the privilege 2 months ago of coming to Nantes, I think for the first time, and I'll talk about that at the end of this presentation. But to me, the invitation is very powerful because cities are compelling to the human imagination. They're compelling because in cities, we see concentrated all of the potentialities of human life, both for possibility and for corruption, and they demand that we think from the whole. They don't give us the way of thinking from the whole, but they invite us to shape what our cities become and what our futures become in a context in which the diversity, the competing truth claims, the competing languages awaken both our fear of disorder and diversity and our longing for a safe place to belong and a way to make a difference. If you look, for instance, at this city of Rio, this is one of those extraordinary photographs from the UNESCO project of the Earth from Above, and imagine what it would be like to have to find your place in this city as a newcomer who has come in from the country. So it's not surprising to me as a priest, which I also am in addition to a long-term banker, that the Bible, which begins in a garden, ends in a city, because it challenges us in the city to ask those fundamental questions of human meaning and purpose. For what are we responsible? For whom are we responsible? What values govern our common life? And in cases where power has been concentrated in ways that leave people out, it also awakens this wondering we have about peace and justice, meaning how we proceed from the whole in a way which benefits the whole, and not only the whole of the city, but that which also lies beyond it. I come from an amazing and inventive city called Chicago, where I lived for the last 50 years. And it's a city which thought nothing of throwing a party for the world called the Columbian Exposition in 1893, 20 years after our city burned to the ground, and yet in other ways has institutionalized division in patterns of segregation and housing and economic isolation. Both to me are manifestations of human imagination. In one case, an imagination and confidence which is expansive. In another case, an imagination which is limited. So while we have the invitation to see from the whole and think from the whole, it becomes necessary to create processes in which we can see in a new way. I was living 20 years ago in Chicago in a complicated life as a banker, doing multinational banking, as a priest serving an African-American parish, as the mother of 3 young children, and as a civic activist, active in many domains. And what I began to notice was how much those functioned as parallel universes, that each had its own language, its own discourse. And the sadness for me was that the cost of that divided and dividing imagination, which had grown up out of a need for specialization, had become an impediment to seeing and acting for the common good. The evidence of this most visibly to me as a mother was that young people in our city at an unprecedented rate were drinking themselves to death and killing each other. And as I began to think about why a young person, at the point in their lives that they had the most energy, the most vision, the most imagination, would do that, only one thing made sense to me, which was that they no longer felt that they had a viable future. And at the point that you feel you don't have a future, then life becomes cheap. Your life and the life of those around you. And there's no effective way, no matter how many police you have, to protect against that. So I began to notice about how we thought about the future and how we learned to think about the future. As a banker, that meant investment and managing risk. Will this investment pay off in productive ways? As a mother, it was the children growing up and changing in front of me every day. As a civic activist, it was what were we trying to build and how do we organize to do it. As a priest, it was about the kingdom of God, meaning how does our vision of a large future determine what we do in the present? I decided to throw a conference because I became intrigued with the question of the images which had gained authority in our common life, in our public life, in terms of our thinking about the future. So I gathered together in Chicago people who had made impossible things possible and began to explore with them, historians, bankers, real estate people, teachers, began to explore with them what could captivate, what could animate, what could raise up visions of the city's future, compelling enough, worthy enough to move forward towards them with a renewed kind of energy and dedication. At that conference, someone asked a very provocative question, which was, what are God's dreams for the city? Well, whether you're religious or not in this context matters less than that the fact that it was a very big question, like the question of utopia, which was to say, what is a dream for the city's future worthy of your life? And it demanded that we think from the whole. Because I was both a banker and a priest, I began to think about the question of economy. What did I imagine as God's economy, meaning an economy which included the whole, which benefited the whole, which saw from the whole? And the image that came to me in that moment was of that familiar recycling symbol, saying, it's an economy in which nothing and no one is wasted. Or, to say it differently, an economy in which everything and everyone counts. 3 days after that conference, that image and the question of how to create such an economy had so demanded my commitment that I gave up my day job as a banker to be in service of that vision. I can say, and I'll come back to this in just a moment, when I went first to Jerusalem to think about cities as a whole, and then on an 8-day silent retreat, the word that came out of the 8 days of silence was think like a mother. If you want such a city, think like a mother. And when I said to my husband, imagine that we were going to have a new child whose gift was imagination, and that we have to think as parents about that child, what would we need to do? And he said, that is the easiest possible child to have. All you have to do is listen. So the question became how to raise up a new imagination for our city, in which people had a new place. One key insight when we came together to think about that was that the future, meaning the young people of our city, and especially the young people who had been left behind, had to have the leadership responsibility. They had to be the activators of the new imagination, and that we had to have a new way of talking that could reach across the established divides. A second thing that became clear was that we needed to open up space in which people could talk again about their dreams. This image comes from Australia, from the editor of the Journal of Future Studies, who says when we look at the future, there are things which push us. There are counterbalances, the weights of the current arrangements that hold us back. But often the least activated, the most neglected dimension in working and having a conversation with the future is that whole domain of inspiration, of motivation, of spirituality, of goal setting, which says, what do we care about enough to make it happen? So we wanted to create a context within which that awakening of the dream became the powerful driving force of the process. This was especially important because of the nature of the challenges facing the city. Ron Heifetz, who teaches at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, describes this as a time of adaptive challenges. Adaptive challenges mean we're at a point that we don't know what to do because we've never been here before. Whereas management is sufficient when you know what to do and you have the information in hand adequate to the task at hand. But in a time of adaptive challenge, you have to activate learning and collective intelligence. And what does that more than anything for human beings is powerful stories. Because stories stretch what we can see and they stretch our confidence in what is possible. The mantra of Imagine Chicago became simply understand, imagine, create. And what that meant was to gather the stories of what had worked, what had been possible, and then to, out of those powerful stories of possibility, to then ask the question of what more would be possible, to move from history as an inventory of possibility into the future before coming back to the present. Because when you activate that domain of imagination and vision, and the future, not any future, but the future you're willing to work to create, then that opens up in the present a new energy and a new experience of possibility. So we went into the city and did that using young people. And what we discovered is that it mattered everything to have young people involved, among other things, because it disarmed the cynicism which otherwise passed for sophistication. Cynicism, we discovered, was the greatest enemy of hope. That at the point that someone said, what if we could do this? That at the point other people said, well, no, it can't, won't get. That was the end of the possibility. It was abortion of ideas on demand. And that we had to disarm the cynicism, and that the greatest hope for doing that came from children. When the children were in front of us, what we discovered was exactly what mothers have always known, which is that it is essential to focus on the promise of what's in front of you, and to create the structures within which the promise gets realized over time. It's also essential to keep the whole in view. That's an act of imagination, to say that differences within the family can be the source of strength. And we knew that innovation would be spurred by bringing together a multiplicity of worldviews within a context in which everyone belonged, and that constructive communication was what would make that possible. So I would put to you first this question, the same question put to us, which is, as you enter into this conversation today, to think, to bring to mind that image of the future which has sufficient authority for you, which is the orienting point that you are willing to dedicate your life to realizing it, and to think about how it gets projected onto a screen like this in which other people can see it. And then to think about the question that accompanies it, which opens up the space within which it becomes more possible. So that question being an invitation into relationship, which says, I don't know, but together we can discover. It makes the adventure of the future that invitation. And here in Nantes, here in Nantes, you have the best possible ambassador for this way of seeing, which is this magnificent elephant, because this elephant in knot, which moves, which invites people to move together, says it is an invitation of imagination and of action, of inspired action, which moves somewhere, but also says beyond the city lives the elephant. And when we imagine life without the elephant, life is over for us too. So how do we build cities in which the elephant has place as an activator of all the creative capacity we bring to the human project? Thank you.